Šį kartą turim svečią, garsų svečią, rašytoją Andriejų Kurkovą.
And our next guest is a famous literary star, writer Andrii Kurkov.
Jo kelios jo knygos jau prieinamos ir lietuviškai.
Several of his books are already available in Lithuanian.
O mums, mūsų forumo rėmuose, man atrodo, tai yra ypatingas svečias.
And I think it's a very special guest in the framework of our forum.
Nes jau antri metai kalba mūsų forume vis tiek vienaip ar kitaip vis prašnekam apie Ukrainą, nes kitaip ir neišeina.
Because for the second year in a row, our forum cannot avoid talking about Ukraine one way or another, because it has become unavoidable.
Ukraina yra ir jau trupučiuko lyg ir užsiminėm šiandien prieš piet. Ukraina ir... Yeah.
We might have already mentioned today before the lunch.
Ukraina yra, vis tiek norim ar nenorim, mums patinka, ne, yra ir mūsų vienybės išbandymas, mūsų vienybės diagnozė.
Whether we like it or not, Ukraine is also a test and a diagnosis of our unity.
Man, tiesą sakant, turiu pasakyti, kad man patiko. Andriejus žinojo mūsų forumo temą. Andriejus žinojo, man patiko tai, kad Andriejus žinojo mūsų temą.
So I like that Andrii was aware of the topic of our forum.
Ir būtų buvę galima tikėtis, kad kalbėsim apie tai, kaip Ukraina traktuoja Europos vienybę.
And we might have expected to speak about the perception of European unity from the Ukrainian perception.
Bet jis pasirinko kitą kampą.
But he chose another angle.
Jis pasirinko kalbėti turbūt apie Ukrainos vienybę.
He chose to speak, I presume, about unity in Ukraine.
Tai daugiau aš nieko čia negaliu pridurti.
So this is about all the introductions I have to make.
Ir prašau, Andriejų kalbėti.
And please welcome Andrii.
Ačiū labai. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here, second time in my life in NIDA.
Labą dieną, labai malonu būti čia. Nidoje lankausi antrą kartą gyvenime.
The first time was after Orange Revolution, but before Euromaidan.
Pirmas kartas buvo po oranžinės revoliucijos, bet prieš Euromaidaną.
Ukraine is a very easy country to define the time in the epoch. Before first Maidan, after second Maidan, and now we have the time divided by the war, before the war and during the war.
Ukrainoje yra labai lengva skaičiuoti laiką, ar matuoti laikotarpius. Yra prieš pirmąjį Maidaną, po antrojo Maidano, o dabar jau mūsų laiką dalyja karas.
I hope that soon we will have another definition after the war.
Tikiuosi, kad netrukus ateis dar vienas laikotarpis po karo.
But nobody knows the date when this war will be over.
Bet niekas nežino datos, kada tas karas baigsis.
And when I'm asked in Europe, what do you think how this war or when this war will end,
Ir kai Europoje manęs kas nors klausia, kaip manote, kada arba kuo baigsis šitas karas,
and I always say that definitely half a year or more after the death of Putin.
Aš visada sakau, kad ne mažiau kaip pusmetis po Putino mirties.
Because when he is dead, there will be a small internal war inside Kremlin.
Nes kai jis mirs, kils nedidelis vidinis karas Kremliuje.
There are 4 groups who are already fighting for the power after Putin.
Jau yra 4 grupuotės, kurios grumėsi kovoja dėl valdžios po Putino.
They are quite small groups, because the population, Russian population, has nothing to do with the future of Russia.
Ir tos grupuotės labai mažos, nes Rusijos gyventojai, Rusijos žmonės neturi nieko bendro su Rusijos ateities kūrimu.
The fight in the Kremlin will be between the generals of the military secret service GRU, FSB, army generals and Russian oligarchs.
Kova dėl valdžios Rusijoje, Kremliuje po Putino bus tarp GRU generolų, FSB generolų ir kariuomenės generolų ir oligarchų.
And only if the Russian oligarchs win, the war will be over sooner.
Ir jeigu laimės rusų oligarchai, tai karas baigsis greičiau.
Because they are the only small group which suffers because of the war and because of the sanctions.
Nes jie yra vieninteliai iš tų nedidelių grupuočių, kurie nukenčia nuo karo ir nuo sankcijų.
But I'm not a politologist, so maybe I should not share my views on the future of this war.
Bet aš nesu politologas, tai nežinau, ar man pridera dalinti savo nuomonę apie karo ateitį.
I'm a writer, I'm very interested in the past and in situation today.
Aš esu rašytojas ir mane labiausiai domina praeitis ir dabarties situacija.
And probably I will say a few words about the past, because the past always defines the future.
Ir tikriausiai turėsiu pasakyti kelias žodžius apie praeitį, todėl kad praeitis visada nulemia ateitį.
In fact, one of the reasons for this war is huge difference between Russian mentality and Ukrainian mentality.
Iš tikrųjų, viena iš šio karo priežasčių yra didžiulis mentalitetų skirtumas tarp Rusijos ir Ukrainos.
When a country collapses, so the society usually goes back to the previous historical matrix.
Kai šalis žlunga, jos visuomenė paprastai atkrenta į ankstesnę istorinę matricą.
Actually, the historical matrix of Russia was always monarchy.
Ir Rusijos istorinė matrica visada buvo monarchija.
Now I think sometimes that Soviet Union was also a monarchy, but with a communist ideology.
Ir aš dabar kartais pagalvoju, kad Sovietų sąjunga irgi buvo monarchija, tik tai su komunistinė ideologija.
Because out of 6 general secretaries, 5 served as general secretaries and were re-elected until they died.
Nes iš 6 generalinių sekretorių 5 tapo generaliniais sekretoriais ir buvo perrinkami iki mirties.
Only one general secretary was dismissed and thrown out from the political elite, Nikita Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian.
Ir vienintelis generalinis sekretorius, kuris buvo nušalintas ir išstumtas iš politinio elito, buvo Nikita Khrushchevas, kuris buvo ukrainietis.
Monarchy means that actually subjects of this monarchy, ordinary people, are loyal to the Tsar. They love him, and if they are very unhappy with him, they kill him and love next one.
Monarchija reiškia, kad paprasti žmonės labai myli savo carą ir kai su juo nesutarė, tai jį nužudo ir myli sekantį carą.
So we know this from Russian history. But from the Soviet history, we can see that people in the Soviet Union were even more loyal, because not a single general secretary was killed.
Ir tai matyti iš Rusijos istorijos, o pasižiūrėjus į Sovietų sąjungą, atrodo, kad žmonės pasidarė dar lojalesni, nes nei vienas generalinis sekretorius nebuvo nužudytas.
Yeah, death of Prigozhin shows that actually Russia is back to proper Russian monarchy.
Ir Prigožino mirtis įrodo, kad Rusija grįžo į tikrąją rusišką monarchiją.
So this way of life created Russian/Soviet collective mentality. When people are passive, unless they are drunk, then they can be active.
Ir šitaip susiklostė rusiškas per brūkšnį sovietinis mentalitetas, kur žmonės yra pasyvūs, nebent prisigeria ir tada gali būti aktyvūs.
They are loyal or they pretend to be loyal, they have fear, they are controlled, and they believe that nothing can be changed.
Jie yra kontroliuojami ir mano, kad niekas negali keisti.
They are loyal, they are controlled,
Yra
they
lojalūs,
have fear,
kontroliuojami.
they have angst, fear,
Jo, bijo ir nemano, kad kas nors gali
and they
pasikeisti.
believe they can do nothing. It's interesting because there are two notions which were always associated with Russia: mystical Russian soul and fatalism.
Įdomu, kad su Rusija visada buvo siejamos dvi tokios savokos, tai mistinė rusiška dvasia ir fatalizmas.
So, mystical Russian soul was created as a promotional image of Russian people for abroad.
Sorry, didn't hear that.
Mystical Russian soul,
Yes.
загадочная русская душа.
Taip.
I mean, this myth was created to practically to promote the image of Russian people, mostly abroad.
Tas mistinės rusiškos dvasios ar sielos mitas buvo sukurtas reklamuoti iš esmės rusiškumui visų pirma užsienyje.
Russophiles and Slavists all over the world for decades were discussing mystical Russian soul.
Ir dešimtmečiais rusofilai ir slavistai visame pasaulyje diskutuoja, aptarinėja tą mistinę rusišką sielą.
I asked recently one of the Slavists at Stanford University if in Stanford there will be new conferences about Russian soul.
Aš neseniai paklausiau vieno Stanfordo universiteto slavisto, ar bus naujų konferencijų apie rusišką sielą.
And he said never more because now we know everything.
Ir jis pasakė, daugiau niekada, nes dabar jau viską žinom.
The second thing, fatalism, was created by classical Russian writers to keep people actually passive and to make them sure that they can change nothing.
O antroji iš tų savokų ar koncepcijų fatalizmas buvo sukurtas klasikinių rusų rašytojų su tuo tikslu išlaikyti žmonės pasyvius ir įtikinti juos, kad jie nieko negali pakeisti.
The ambassador of Russian fatalism was Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Rusiško fatalizmo ambasadorius buvo Fyodoras Dostojevskis.
And now there are many discussions if Dostoevsky is guilty in the Russian aggression in Ukraine.
O dabar daug diskutuojama dėl to, ar Dostojevskis kaltas dėl, ar iš dalies kaltas dėl rusų agresijos Ukrainoje.
Partially he is guilty because Russian elite is actually educated on Dostoevsky. And in Dostoevsky's books, actually, people should punish themselves for the crimes they commit. They are not punished neither by society nor by the legal system.
Ir iš dalies Dostojevskis yra dėl to kaltas, todėl kad Rusijos elitas yra išmokslintas pagal Dostojevskį, kuris sako, kad žmonės turėtų patys nusibausti už savo nusikaltimus, nes jų nenubaudžia nei visuomenė, nei teisinė sistema.
Historical matrix of Ukraine is Ukrainian Cossack state or Cossacks independent territory of 16th century.
Ukrainos istorinė matrica yra kazokų valstybė, ar kazokų nepriklausomos teritorijos 16 amžiuje.
Because we don't have in oral history in Ukraine memories about Ukraine being part of Lithuanian kingdom.
Kadangi Ukrainos žodinėje istorijoje nėra išsaugotas prisiminimas apie tai, kad Ukraina priklausė Lietuvos karalystiai.
In fact, actually, if we talk about historical influences, when there is no memory, it means there is no bad memory.
Ir iš tikrųjų tai reiškia, kad kai neišsaugomas prisiminimas, toks istorinis prisiminimas, tai reiškia, kad nėra ką blogo prisiminti.
But Ukrainians became active in 16th century and 17th century.
Bet ukrainiečiai pasidarė aktyvūs 16 ir 17 amžiuje.
And they created their own social system where they had elections of the hetman, who was the head of the army and head of the territory.
Ir jie susikūrė savo sistemą, kur išsirinkdavo etmonus, kurie būdavo ir kariuomenės vadai, ir teritorijos lyderiai.
These were not traditional elections like today, just the most important Cossacks were choosing who will be their head.
Ir tai nebuvo tokie rinkimai, kaip juos suprantam šiandien, tiesiog visi įtakingiausi kazokai susirinkdavo ir išsirinkdavo savo vadovą.
And when one hetman was chosen, several days after that there would be already intrigues to replace him with another one.
Ir kai būdavo išrenkamas vienas etmonas, tai jau po kelių savaičių prasidėdavo intrigos jį nuversti ir išsirinkti kitą.
Every Cossack thought that he has opinion and he has ideas which can change the life of the society.
Ir kiekvienas kazokas manydavo, kad turi savo nuomonę ir turi idėjų, kaip pakeisti visos visuomenės gyvenimą.
This is the basis of Ukrainian individualist mentality.
Ir tuo pagrįstas ukrainietiškas individualistinis mentalitetas.
This is the reason also why we have in Ukraine more than 400 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice.
Taip pat dėl šios priežasties Ukrainoje šiuo metu Teisingumo departamente yra registruota daugiau kaip 400 politinių partijų.
Because every Ukrainian who wants to go into politics, he looks around and he doesn't find a party he likes and he creates his own.
Nes kiekvienas ukrainietis, kuris nori eiti į politiką, apsidairo ir neranda partijos, kuri jam patiktų, ir todėl susikuria savo.
If I were very rich and from childhood I loved to collect things. I had collection of stamps, coins, cacti, etc.
Aš nuo vaikystės labai mėgstu ką nors kolekcionuoti ir kolekcionuodavau pašto ženklus ir akmenukus ir kaktusus ir taip toliau.
So if I were very rich, I could start collecting small political parties in Ukraine.
Todėl jeigu būčiau labai turtingas, tai galėčiau pradėti kolekcionuoti mažas Ukrainos politinės partijas.
Because small parties you can buy for $20,000-$25,000.
Nes mažą partiją galima nusipirkti už $20,000-$25,000.
It doesn't mean that you buy papers of the party.
Ir tai nereiškia, kad nusiperki tos partijos dokumentus.
It means that you find the person who registered the party.
Tai reiškia, kad susirandi tą žmogų, kuris įregistravo partiją.
You pay him and you tell him that you want to be the head of the party.
Susimoki jam ir pasakai, kad nori būti tos partijos vadovas.
And he will organize a general meeting of the party and you will be elected the head of the party.
Ir jis suorganizuos visuotinę partijos sueigą ir būsi išrinktas partijos lyderiu.
It sounds like real anarchy.
Skamba kaip tikra anarchija.
But in fact, actually, I think Ukraine is the motherland of anarchy.
Bet aš iš tikrųjų manau, kad Ukraina yra anarchijos tėvynė.
Because the biggest anarchic army of the world was created in Ukraine in 1918 by Nestor Makhno.
Nes didžiausia anarchistų kariauna buvo sukurta Ukrainoje 1918 metais Ernesto Makhno.
Nestor
Makhno.
Nestor. Ernesto Che Guevara and Nestor Makhno. And this army had more than 35,000 soldiers.
Ir toje armijoje buvo daugiau kaip 35,000 kareivių.
I'm stopping myself from going deeper in the history. But I want first to, before I will read you my text about identity, I wanted to talk about mentality, because mentality is instrument by which the country or the system can control its people.
Aš toliau nesileisiu dar giliau į istoriją, tik tai prieš skaitydamas pranešimą apie tapatybę, norėjau trumpai pakomentuoti mentalitetą, nes mentalitetas yra priemonė, kurią valstybė gali panaudoti savo žmonėms kontroliuoti.
What is Russian identity? We know Russian mentality actually is collective, and all Russians have the same image of great Russia in their head.
Kokia yra rusiška tapatybė, tai rusų mentalitetas yra kolektyvinis ir visi rusai galvoje turi tą didžiosios Rusijos vaizdinį.
So everything in Russia is great. The history is great, culture is great, which means that the people are great who created this history and culture.
Ir viskas Rusijoje yra didu, yra didi istorija ir didi kultūra, ir tai reiškia, kad turi būti ir didi tauta, kuris sukūrė tokią didžią istoriją ir kultūrą.
So Russian identity means actually being great and being more important than anybody else.
Todėl rusų tapatybė iš esmės ir reiškia būti didžiais ir būti svarbesniais už visus aplinkui.
Strangely enough, this identity accepted most visually by the Russian elite.
Kad ir kaip būtų keista, akivaizdžiausiai, ryškiausiai tokią tapatybę savo prisijima Rusijos elitas.
One of the best examples is Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov.
Ir vienas geriausių to pavyzdžių yra užsienio reikalų ministras Lavrovas.
In Ukraine, actually, the attitude towards identity is more European.
Ukrainoje požiūris į tapatybę yra labiau europietiškas.
Usually identity is made of history, culture and language.
Paprastai tapatybę sudaro istorija, kultūra ir kalba.
In Ukraine there are many representatives of mixed identities.
Ukrainoje yra daug mišrios tapatybės atstovų.
But it only means that the language can be different, but the history of Ukraine and culture of Ukraine belong to them also.
Bet tai reiškia, kad jie kalba skirtingomis kalbomis, bet Ukrainos istorija ir kultūra taip pat priklauso ir jiems.
Because of this difference, Russia for 300 years was trying to assimilate Ukrainians, to take away their identity and to make them Russians.
Dėl tokio skirtumo Rusija 300 metų stengiasi asimiliuoti ukrainiečius, atimti jų tapatybę ar ištrinti jų tapatybę ir paversti juos rusais.
The easiest way to assimilate people is to force them to speak Russian and to forget their mother tongue.
Lengviausias būdas asimiliuoti tautą yra priversti ją kalbėti rusiškai ir pamiršti savo gimtąją kalbą.
The best success of the Soviet policy of assimilation of people is Kyrgyzstan.
Sėkmingiausias sovietinio tautos asimiliavimo pavyzdys yra Kirgizija.
Some Kyrgyz, or many Kyrgyz speak and know Russian language better than Russians.
Some Kirghiz?
Many Kyrgyz peoples know Russian and speak Russian better than Russian people.
Daugelis kirgizų moka ir kalba rusiškai geriau negu patys rusai.
One of the best Russian language writers in the Soviet period was Kyrgyz Chingiz Aitmatov.
Vienas iš geriausių rusiškai rašysių rašytojų sovietiniais laikais buvo kirgizas Chingiz Aitmatovas.
Chingiz Aitmatov.
Aitmatovas.
In 1709, Peter the Great fought with his army against Ukrainian hetman Mazepa, who was supported by Swedish King Karl XII.
1709 metais Petras I kovojo prieš
hetman Mazepa.
Ukrainiečio etmoną Mazepą, padedamas švedų karaliaus.
That was the first battle, actually, to expand Russian language, Russian culture, Russian history and Russian lands.
Tai buvo pirmasis mūšis, kuriuo siekta išplėsti Rusijos kalbą, kultūrą ir žemes.
Because in Ukrainian case, practically during 70 years of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian language was removed from 60-70% of the territory of Ukraine.
Nes Ukrainos atveju per 70 sovietmečio metų Ukrainiečių kalba buvo pašalinta iš maždaug 60-70% teritorijos.
From the 1991, from the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Nuo 91 metų ir nuo tada, kai Sovietų sąjunga žlugo,
Ukrainian mentality was coming back on the territories of ex-Soviet Union quicker than the Ukrainian language.
Ukrainietiškas mentalitetas grįžo į tas sovietų okupuotas teritorijas greičiau negu ukrainiečių kalba.
And we had for 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union internal border inside Ukraine between still Soviet/Russian mentality, collective mentality, and the center of this mentality was Donbass, in fact, and Ukrainian mentality in the center and to the west from Kyiv.
Ir ilgą laiką viduje Ukrainos ėjo tarsi siena, kuris skyrė rytus ir tą tokio rusiško ar sovietinio mentaliteto teritoriją, kurios centras buvo Donbasas, ir priešingai ukrainiečių mentaliteto teritoriją į vakarus nuo Kijevo.
And if we didn't have the war, this border was moving towards the east. So maybe in 20-25 years, finally the border between Ukrainian mentality would coincide with the border between Russia and Ukraine.
Ir jeigu nebūtų kilęs karas, tai ta siena jinai judėjo į rytus ir galbūt po 20 ar 30 metų ta siena tarp ukrainietiško ir rusiško mentaliteto būtų susilyginusi su siena tarp Ukrainos ir Rusijos.
I mentioned Peter the Great.
Paminėjau Petrą Didįjį.
If you listen to Putin sometimes, every week he says something good about Peter the Great.
Jeigu paklausytumėt Putino, tai jisai beveik kas savaitę pasako, ką nors gero apie Petrą Didįjį.
Because he wants to repeat the success of Peter the Great in Ukraine, the success of Poltava battle.
Nes jis nori Ukrainoje pakartoti Petro Didžiojo sėkmę ir Poltavos mūšio sėkmę.
The battle took place in 1709 and Peter the Great in 1720 signed the first decree banning Ukrainian language books from the church and banning publication of religious texts in Ukrainian.
Tas mūšis įvyko 1709 metais, o 1720 Petras I pasirašė pirmąjį dekretą draudžiantį knygų ukrainiečių kalba platinimą bažnyčiose ir visų religinių knygų spaudą.
Today on the occupied territories of Ukraine, Ukrainian language is banned in schools.
Šiandien okupuotose Ukrainos teritorijose ukrainiečių kalba draudžiama mokyklose.
And recently Russia brought 7 tons of school books on Russian history to the occupied territories.
Ir neseniai Rusija atvežė 7 tonas knygų apie
textbooks on Russian history for the schools.
Taip, vadovėlių, Rusijos istorijos vadovėlių mokykloms.
So, I mean, the policy which was started by Peter the Great was going through the centuries and is continuing today.
Taigi Petro Didžiojo pradėta politika truko visus tos 300 mečius ir tebesitęsia šiandien.
Well, I think I will stop myself now because I can go on for a long time.
Aš dar galėčiau tęsti labai ilgai, bet gal verčiau nustosiu.
I have only one question. I will read my text in English. Do you want to read also? No, I can just. Okay.
Everyone has.
Okay.
Jeigu kam reikia, jisai skaitys angliškai, jeigu kam nors reikia lietuviško, tai turbūt ten yra dar atspausdinto, ne?
It is much easier then.
Yeah, everyone has this printed out.
And I will be very happy if after you have heard or read the text, you would ask questions, whatever you are interested to know about the history of today's situations in Ukraine.
Ir būtų labai malonu, jeigu išklausę ar perskaitę tekstą, jeigu tik turėsit klausimų, juos ir užduotumėt apie Ukrainos istoriją arba dabartinę padėtį.
Is Ukrainian identity bulletproof? Let me tell you a little story about the village of Germanivka, near the town of Abuchiv, a 40-minute drive from Kyiv. Here you can find most interesting examples of 19th century architecture. Until 1919, a large Jewish community lived its stormy life here, the history of which ends with 2 bloody pogroms. The border between Poland and the Russian Empire once ran next to the village. Here in the 11th century, there was a protected settlement discovered by Ukrainian archaeologists in the late 1990s. And here in 1663, the Black Council took place, a meeting and an attempt to negotiate between the 2 opposing Ukrainian Cossack clans, led by Hetman Ivan Vygovsky on one hand and Hetman Yuri Khmelnytsky on the other. Ivan Vygovsky was considered a pro-Polish politician, and Yuri Khmelnytsky was considered pro-Russian. The meeting ended in bloodshed, and from that moment in Ukrainian history, a period begins which is officially called the ruins in school history textbooks. This is the era of internecine wars, which only strengthened the political influence of Moscow on the territory of today's Ukraine. Ukrainian identity has been constructed on the basis of such stories, which are passed down as a heady mix of factual historical sources, historical and cultural interpretation, and myth. Interpretation and myth are ghost-like, and we all know that you cannot shoot a ghost. So should we assume that Ukrainian identity is indeed bulletproof? If we assume this, then we also allow that this identity is something ethereal, that it can be viewed by each person in their own way. How then could such an identity be used to build nationhood, which is what Ukrainians are right now in the process of building? Last month, the huge Soviet monument to the motherland, which stands over the Dnipro River, facing east, was renovated. The Soviet hammer and sickle were at last removed from the motherland's giant shield and replaced with the Ukrainian trident. We can ask ourselves why it took 30 years to take this step. Did it require outright aggression and invasion to galvanize the forces of this change? What needed to change exactly? For the purposes of this talk, I will consider identity as how we individually and collectively understand the history and culture of the territory we call home, and how we evaluate our place in that history and culture. Let us start with history. Ukrainian politicians have been fond of commissioning new editions of history so that it better fits their ideology and their ideological discourse. Sometimes a change in emphasis appears quite innocently and has no long-term consequences. I remember how President Viktor Yushchenko was fond of Tripillian culture. This is an archaeological culture of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age period, which thrived on the territory of Ukraine and Moldova 7,000 years ago. He sincerely believed, and probably still believes, that Ukrainians are the heirs of this culture. Some historians began to write books about the Tripillian culture as if it were the cradle of the Ukrainian nation, and the first private museums of Tripillian culture appeared near Kyiv, where archaeologists found traces of this civilization. Since the departure of Yushchenko from Ukrainian politics, no one talks about there being a direct connection between Tripillian culture and modern Ukraine. President Putin is fond of editing history in a way that certainly does have an impact on contemporary life. His article dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the victory over fascism was published and read even in the United States. It makes no sense to go into detail about its content, but in our current situation, when Putin has turned 3,000 kilometers of the Ukrainian border with Russia and Belarus into an endless front line, it is worth quoting from its final paragraph. Based on a common historical memory, we can and must trust each other. This will serve as a solid basis for successful negotiations and concerted actions for the sake of strengthening stability and security on the planet, for the sake of prosperity and well-being of all states. Without exaggeration, this is our common duty and responsibility to the whole world, to present and future generations. This was a quote from Putin. What common memory is he talking about? Putin has said that Ukraine was invented by Vladimir Lenin. Apparently, before Lenin, there was no Ukraine. An earlier version of Russian history claimed that Ukraine was invented by the Germans at the end of the First World War. This version was favored both in the Soviet times and is still favored in post-Soviet Russia. In some ways, Putin may be right, because it was the Germans who helped Lenin to travel secretly to Russia from exile in order to lead the 1917 revolution and overthrow the Tsar. He was sent to Russia from Germany in a sealed railway carriage in the guise of a valuable cargo. Under contemporary Russian law, Lenin would be considered a double foreign agent. In theory, this should be written on his mausoleum on Red Square, Foreign Agent Lenin. You can laugh a lot at the paradoxes of rewriting or editing history in the Russian Federation, but inside Ukraine, history can be a thorny topic too. Every now and then, there are heated disputes between objectivist historians and patriotic historians. One such ongoing dispute is between Yaroslav Ritsak, author of a brilliant new book on Ukrainian history, Overcoming the Past, A Global History of Ukraine, and Volodymyr Vyatrovich, an enthusiastic politician and historian, author of many books and former director of the National Institute of Memory. The main subject of this dispute is, can memory and history be selective? I think it can, and I am afraid that we indeed live in this selective history. Recently, in the very center of Kiev, not far from the Golden Gates, a memorial plaque appeared on the wall of the building in which the Boulangerie Café is located. The board depicts a man in a military uniform from 1918-1920. His name is Mykola Krasovsky. The plaque states that he was an important intelligence officer in the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic, and that he lived in this house in the early 1900s. For 99% of Kiev residents, his name means nothing, and the rare people who know the name of Krasovsky are unlikely to know that he had something to do with intelligence. In fact, for most of his life, Krasovsky was a renowned detective who solved the most intricate and complex crimes in and around Kiev. He was also one of the investigators in the most famous anti-Semitic case in the Russian Empire, the case of Mendel Beilis. This case was very similar to the Dreyfus affair in France. The two cases showed how common anti-Semitic views were among the elite in Europe and throughout the Russian Empire, including in Ukraine, and not only among the elite. Mendel Baylis was accused of ritually murdering an Orthodox boy in Kiev to obtain blood for making matzah for Pesach. Krasovsky, from the outset, did not believe in the version of ritual murder. He soon also found the real killers, who turned out not to be Jews at all, but local Kiev thieves. The authorities needed a Jewish version of the murder. Krasovsky was dismissed from the case. The authorities even tried to put him in jail for embezzling 15 kopecks from the state. And perhaps worst of all for the strengthening of Ukrainian identity is the fact that Krasovsky's participation in the Baylis case is not mentioned on the memorial plaque. Indeed, the case is not mentioned in the course of legal history read to the students of law at Kiev's prestigious Mohyla Academy. How can we evaluate our place in a history we do not know? For almost 400 years, Russia has been fighting against Ukrainian identity and against the Ukrainian language in order to weaken and destroy resistance to the Russification of Ukrainian territories. In the 17th century, Ukrainian church books were banned and destroyed on the orders of Russian Patriarch Philaret. In 1720, Peter the Great signed a decree banning the publication of any religious book in the Ukrainian language. In 1763, Catherine II forbade the use of Ukrainian as a language of tuition at the oldest Ukrainian university, Kiev Mohyla Academy. In 1804, teaching in Ukrainian was forbidden in schools. In 1884, Tsar Alexander III banned theatrical performances in Ukrainian. 4 years later, in 1888, he also banned the use of the Ukrainian language in official institutions and made it unlawful to give a Ukrainian name to a child at baptism. In 1892, a decree was signed banning the translation of books from Russian into Ukrainian. Ironically, today, some Ukrainian authors are banning their translations of their books into Russian. In the 300-year period when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, various tsars signed more than 40 decrees prohibiting or restricting the use of the Ukrainian language in Ukraine. After the revolution of 1917, Ukraine gained a short but unstable period of independence. And already in 1921, the country again became part of the new Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule allowed for some formal Ukrainianization to take place, but soon the process of Russification was revived. I remember how in Kiev in the 1970s and 80s, anyone who spoke Ukrainian was assumed to be either an ardent nationalist or an uneducated peasant. I'm glad that these times are over and the Ukrainian language has begun to return to the territories from which it was expelled. However, the threat to Ukraine and Ukrainian culture remains, and because of Russian aggression, the threat has now magnified. All the policies of Imperial Russia are now being implemented by Putin. Teaching in Ukrainian is again prohibited in the occupied territories of Ukraine, and Ukrainian books have been withdrawn from libraries there and destroyed. However, it is probably true to say that the populations in the regions still occupied by Russia were largely unaffected by the issue of Ukrainian identity, except when Ukrainian identity was used as a threat to maintain support for the oligarchs who ruled in those regions. Stay loyal to us or you will be overrun by bloodthirsty nationalists from Western Ukraine, was the threatening message in Donbass. Indeed, since Western Ukraine was under Soviet rule only for 40 years, its Ukrainian identity remained relatively intact. And in eastern regions, it was enough to hear someone speak Ukrainian to label that person as a nationalist. Since independence, two stereotypes have found fertile ground in the minds of Eastern and Western Ukrainians and were promoted by respective elites for their own purposes. According to the stereotypes, all Western Ukrainians are fascists and all Eastern Ukrainians are criminals. I often tell the story of going to Lugansk region in 2015 to meet with the local folk and talk about literature and identity with other writers and poets. A man I spoke to on the street after our event told me he had never been abroad. "I've been to Moscow," he announced proudly, "but never abroad." For that man, and doubtless for many of his neighbors, Ukraine was irrelevant, in no way part of his identity. No bullets were required there. Our audience in Luhansk region was very surprised that we had come at all. They didn't expect to have to share their cultural experience with people from Kyiv or anywhere else. I had the impression that some of the audience wanted me and my colleagues to feel like strangers on their territory. They seemed to be clinging to this Soviet identity 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I felt a similar reaction of surprise in Suvorove, in Bessarabia, in the far southwest of Odessa region. But here people wanted to know why they had been abandoned by the rest of Ukraine, why nobody came to talk to them before. The town of Suvorove once carried the Turkic name Shikirli Kitai, and it is written on the monument on the main square. I certainly felt like a stranger there. It was the same in Vinohradiv, a Hungarian-speaking town on the western side of the Carpathian Mountains. Our audiences in these places looked at each other, eyebrows raised, and asked, why haven't these strangers come to talk about Ukraine with us before? While making these trips, I learned a great deal about Ukraine and its hugely multifaceted identity. But I am not sure the people we visited learned much from us. They suspected that we had been sent by political forces in Kyiv. For them, any public discussion about Ukraine, Ukraine's past and future, was simply a sign that elections were approaching. During 30 years of independence, little or no effort was made on a national level towards the development of mutual understanding between the many and varied regions of the country. Surely this is one of the tragic conditions which has allowed Russia to do so much harm since 2014 and before that also. In the garden of eastern Ukraine, the seeds of separatism were sown long before 2014. During the Orange Revolution of 2004-2005, divisions in the country were obvious to all. But during that winter, there were some let's try to understand each other discussions and some demonstrations of goodwill by people in civil society on both sides. At that moment, as I stood in the bookshop on Kyiv's European Square, in earnest, dual, if not multi-language conversations about Ukraine and our identity, I could feel the darning threads crisscrossing our understandings. We had the sense that the gaping tears in our national identity could be mended and that the result would be a collage of spectacular beauty. But there were those for whom mutual understanding and respect between the regions of Ukraine was a threat, and in today's war, we see the result of those forces, opportunistic in some cases and well-planned and well-funded in others. I'm still impressed by the story of the man from Cherkasy region, who at the start of Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine was ready to welcome Russian invaders and gave information to the enemy about military objects in his area. He was arrested, and at his trial, it was as if he had woken up a new person. I believe he was genuinely mortified by what he had done. He donated a large sum to Ukraine's army in personal recompense. Nobody had paid him to commit his act of treachery. He had been misled and had not heard or had not understood the voices from the other side of the argument. If you drive south out of Kiev for about 5 hours, turning right after Hadjibey estuary and taking the Odessa region road that skirts Moldova, you end up in Bessarabia, an area rich in cultural diversity and natural beauty, but otherwise rather poor. This is where I met the ethnic Bulgarians of Suvorove and where I noticed a sign pointing to Frumushika Nova, the location of the world's tallest monument to a shepherd. For 17 years now, ethnic Moldovan Alexander Palariev, the owner of that monument, as well as a large herd of sheep, has been single-handedly stitching together the cloth of his native Bessarabian culture, bringing back to life an area cleared of civilization when the Soviet authorities turned it into the military training ground, forcibly resettling Palariev's family and entire communities. Palariev understands and loves the history and culture of this place, but he has not only rebuilt the picturesque model of his forefathers' lifestyle, he seeks to move from Ushikanova into the 21st century, aware of the community's responsibility to the planet and its role as part of a forward-looking Ukraine that thrives on its ethnic diversity. There is nothing ethereal about many of Ukraine's ethnic groups and minorities. They are identifiable, and within their communities, they have a very strong sense of identity. However, Ukrainian identity is a structure with many varied and beautiful details and with many gaping tears between the varied and beautiful details. These tears have resisted being stitched together. Apart from a simple lack of effort or even a policy on the part of successive Kiev governments, one of the strongest forces preventing a convergence of understanding in Ukraine to support the building of national identity has been Russia's effort to dominate and divide. Many Ukrainians believe that the current war began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the appearance on maps of Ukrainian territory of so-called separatist republics. That was the moment when Russia directly participated in hostilities and entered the territory of Ukraine with entire artillery brigades to shell the city of Ilovaisk or capture the city of Debaltseve. In fact, Russia started the war for cultural dominance over Ukraine and other ex-Soviet countries much earlier. The Kremlin has spent tens of millions of euros every year since the year 2000 to prove to the whole world that Russian culture dominates not only in the former Soviet Union, but even in the areas outside of Eastern Europe. The Kremlin paid for Russia to be the guest of honor at all major international book fairs. And when Russia was already an honored guest as a country, as for example at the Paris Book Fair in 2005, then a couple of years later, St. Petersburg became an honored guest city there, and then Moscow. The constant broadcasts about the great Russian culture on Russia Today could not but convince foreign viewers of this channel that there is no more powerful or more important culture in the world than Russian culture. And for Russian-speaking viewers around the world, Satellite TV channels like Kultura and Nostalgia have worked and are working to encourage an exaggerated pride in the achievements of Russian art, which flourishes among former residents of the USSR, regardless of their country of residence. Yes, and hundreds of artists, musicians, and writers are still traveling to Russian-speaking and Russophile audiences around the world so that this cultural, but in reality political, connection would not be lost. If you look closely, all this activity has constituted the cultural component of the Kremlin's political project called the Russian World. The project was designed to create powerful support for Russian international policies and Russian influence, but the effect has been to superimpose Russian/Soviet identity on the ex-subjects of the Soviet state. Many Ukrainians have successfully resisted accepting the Russian world's version of reality, while many Europeans have fallen prey to it. In the occupied cities of Ukraine, Russians use hammers to smash commemorative plaques on the houses where Ukrainian writers and poets, philosophers and scientists lived. In Chernihiv, the Russian military during the occupation burned the archives of the KGB to prevent Ukraine from citing specific dossiers that show how the Soviet government cracked down on Ukrainian cultural figures. After all, in the 1930s, almost an entire generation of Ukrainian cultural figures was arrested and shot by the Moscow-led communist regime. For 50 years, they were never mentioned. The rebirth of Ukrainian identity is the process of rediscovering the forbidden past. For many individuals, this war has intensified the search for lost identity because Ukrainians need identity as a soldier needs a bulletproof vest and a weapon. In 2014, Russia declared that it was not participating in the war, but only supporting the separatists and restoring historical justice in Crimea. Having forced many Crimean Tatar activists to leave their historical homeland or arrested on trumped-up charges those who refused to leave, Russia has proven that historical justice has nothing to do with their plan. But how well do other Ukrainians understand the history and culture of their compatriots from Crimea? How do they evaluate the impact of that history and culture on their own lives as Ukrainians? I have wonderful memories of holidays in Yevpatoria on the eastern side of the Crimean Peninsula. We always rented a room in the home of a Russian family. The house had a closed courtyard with grapevines all around, and the rooms were furnished with beautiful and exotic carpets and chests. It was only many years later that I realized the home I had so enjoyed on my holidays was really a home stolen from a Tatar family that had been turfed out of it with 30 minutes warning in 1944. Taking practically nothing with them, they were deported to Kazakhstan or Siberia. Perhaps they did not even survive the journey. I know that story now and feel shame for not knowing it as a child, but I am afraid the Crimean Tatars' history is still little understood in Ukraine, and few Ukrainians were aware of any impact of Crimean Tatar culture on the country as a whole until some cafes and restaurants serving Crimean Tatar food started to appear in the cities of other regions. Perhaps ignorance is bliss. If people understood more, the food in those restaurants might leave a bitter taste in their mouths. As I understand it, many Crimean Tatars see themselves as Ukrainians, and why shouldn't they? No doubt Russian aggression has supported this development in their self-identification. The war has certainly inspired and bolstered countless projects that encourage Ukrainians to take the question of their identity more seriously. At Barman Diktat, in a cellar on Kiev's main street, live music gigs are often preceded by meetings of the History Lovers Club, featuring stories for adults, discussions about relevant historical topics. The discussions are sometimes led by the writer Oleg Krishtopa, sometimes by the literary critic Nastya Yevdokimova, and sometimes by the two of them together with specially invited guests, experts in one or another area of history or contemporary life. These discussions are recorded on video and posted on a YouTube channel under the same name, Stories for Adults. The channel is gaining popularity and the number of subscribers has already passed the 250,000 mark. One early event of this type at Barman Diktat dealt with the question, can Gogol be considered a Ukrainian writer? Over 1 or 2 glasses of whiskey, after all, the hour-and-a-half discussion took place in a bar, the participants concluded that he could. As I am trying to show here, Ukrainian identity is a work in progress, and the development of civil society is perhaps one of the most powerful tools in this work. The constant fundraising projects and the all-pervasive volunteer efforts to help those in need bring together Ukrainians from different backgrounds and with differing understandings of our history and culture. The work and public activity of Ukraine's bloggers, journalists, historians, writers, and artists provide food for thought as well as platforms for discussion and, of course, controversy. The question of Ukrainian identity is omnipresent. Recently, one blogger wrote, "You can kick me, but I will say it. Ukrainians deserved this war with Russia, and it is a consequence of the previous 30 years of independence, a period of mismanagement, selfishness, theft, and sloppiness." His exposé of a passive and mean-spirited nation prepared to stand by and watch a few Atlanteans holding the country on their shoulders caused an uproar on civil media, but it must also have provoked quite quiet reflection on the part of many readers. What does it mean to me to be a Ukrainian? We need enough people to be asking themselves this question, and they need support to find the answers. The fact is, many leading Ukrainians who found an answer for themselves and worked to support others in this discovery process have been killed in this criminal aggression. Others, like the Crimean Tatar leader Nariman Jalal, are sitting in Russian prisons. The loss of their active participation in the building of our national identity is a cruel blow, but others can and do take up the baton. As I said, this is a work in progress. In Germanivka today, people work hard on their plots of fertile land. There is a museum, an art gallery, and a monument to the Black Council of 1663. While out on her walks, an Afro-Ukrainian resident of Germanivka called Julieta shares her excellent knowledge of canine training with local dog owners. She is thinking of starting a dog owner club in the village. Her Dutch poet husband, who moved here from Rotterdam some years ago, is planning retreats for international writers on their small holding. Ukrainian identity is bright and colorful, an easy target for the Kremlin regime that understands the power that a sense of national identity possesses. The Kremlin has done all in its power to prevent it from developing, but their aggression is indeed serving to make Ukraine's identity bulletproof. What is important to remember is that while it is relatively easy to attach a Ukrainian trident to a Soviet symbol, the process of forging Ukrainian identity is going to be a little bit more complicated. We cannot attach a Ukrainian trident to the remnant of the Ukrainian/Soviet identity and consider the job done. Thank you very much for your patience.
Labai ačiū už šitą ir pradinę įžanginę kalbą ir šitą esė.
Thank you so much for both the introductory speech and the essay that you've just read.
Man atrodo, kad ar veikia? Man atrodo, kad šitas pranešimas tik sustiprino, bet man tas nuojautas, kurias mes turime apie Ukrainą.
At least to me, this presentation has served only to strengthen the feelings or sensations that we have about Ukraine.
Kaip tik prieš pietinio pranešimo kontekstuose mes kalbėjom apie tai, kad kaip tik kalbėjom apie Ukrainą ir kalbėjom apie tai, kad apie solidarumą, ten Europos solidarumą ir subsidiarumas į Ukrainos atžvilgiu.
In our discussions before the lunch, Ukraine came up in the context of solidarity and subsidiarity in terms of support to Ukraine.
Vienas iš motyvų buvo, kad taip, dabar šiuo momentu reikalingas tikras solidarumas ir subsidiarumas, tai reiškia reikalinga pagalba Ukrainai, tame tarpe stojant, pavyzdžiui, į Europos Sąjungą.
So one of the motives was that at the moment we definitely need true solidarity and subsidiarity to support Ukraine, among other things, by welcoming it to the EU.
Bet čia pat nuskambėjo ir tema, kad žinoma, jeigu Ukraina atsigaus, mes to tikime, ir kai jie atsigaus.
But at the same time, what we heard was that when Ukraine recovers, and we believe that it will,
ir kai atsigaus, ne tik tai, kad jeigu. Aha. Tai tada mes turėsim klausimų.
So when that happens,
Tai yra klausimas.
so when that happens, the question is,
ar Ukraina sugebės būti solidari ir subsidiari su visa mūsų Europos Sąjunga.
Whether Ukraine will be capable of solidarity and subsidiarity with the rest of the EU.
Aš šito klausimą nesiūlau dabar diskutuoti, nes jis tiesiog aš tik tai, kad suprastumėm kontekstą.
And I'm not suggesting a discussion on this question. I'm just reminding of it for the context.
Bet aš norėčiau klausti, kaip Andriejus mano, kas bus su Ukrainos tapatybė, kai, sakykime, bent stos taika.
But I would like to ask you, how do you imagine or how do you believe what will happen with the Ukrainian identity when peace comes, like when war ends?
Well, logically, I think once the war is over, Ukraine needs to be reconstructed.
Manau, logiška įsivaizduoti, kad kai karas baigsis, Ukrainą reikės atstatyti, atkurti.
I traveled a lot in Europe and talked about Ukraine with lots of audiences.
Aš daug keliavau po Europą ir kalbėjausi apie Ukrainą su skirtingomis publikomis.
And I understand that actually a lot of people in the West are waiting for the end of the war to come to Ukraine to help to rebuild the country.
Ir suprantu, kad vakaruose yra daug žmonių, kurie laukia karo pabaigos, kad galėtų atvykti į Ukrainą, padėti atstatinėti šalies.
So, I mean, there will be a huge international drive to come and to recreate the country which defended its independence against very powerful enemy.
Todėl kils toks didelis tarptautinis vajus ir visi suvažiuos padėti atstatyti šalies, kurie apgynė savo nepriklausomybę nuo didelės agresorės.
This should be a very important motivation for Ukrainians themselves also to take part in this rebuilding and to come from abroad for the refugees.
Tai turėtų taip pat būti labai stipri motyvacija patiems ukrainiečiams prisidėti prie savo šalies atstatymo, o taip pat sugrįžti pabėgėliams.
One example, there is one Italian architecture bureau which is now preparing plans of rebuilding Mariupol.
Vienas pavyzdys yra toksai Italijos architektų biuras, kuris šiuo metu braižo planus, kaip reikės atstatyti Mariupolį.
So, I mean, in the Western Europe, people have no doubt that Ukraine will win.
Taigi vakaruose ir Europoje žmonės nei kiek neabejoja, kad Ukraina nugalės.
And this attitude is also helping Ukrainians to feel capable and powerful enough, actually, to win the war and to rebuild the country and to join European Union.
Ir toks požiūris labai padeda patiems Ukrainos žmonėms tikėti ir pergalę kare, ir šalies atstatymu, ir prisijungimu prie Europos Sąjungos.
Because Europe showed more solidarity to Ukraine than Ukraine ever could show solidarity to Europe.
Nes Europa parodė didesnį solidarumą su Ukraina, negu Ukraina kada nors galėtų parodyti solidarumą Europai.
There is still a problem, which I mentioned, that different regions of Ukraine were not really united by culture, by information. I mean, please translate and I will...
Dar lieka problema, kaip ir minėjau pranešime, kad skirtingi Ukrainos regionai nesijaučia iki galo vienijami kalbos ir kultūros ir panašių dalykų.
Which means that I am talking on behalf of Kyiv, but maybe not on behalf of Odessa.
O tai reiškia, kad aš kalbu Kijevo vardu, bet nebūtinai Odesos vardu.
I want to share with you my own small theory of ideal country.
Norėčiau jums papasakoti savo teorijėlę apie tai, kas yra ideali šalis.
So the ideal country is the one where there are 5 spaces which coincide.
Ideali šalis yra tokia, kurioje sutampa 5 erdvės.
It's a geopolitical space, the borders of the country.
Geopolitinė erdvė tai yra šalies sienos.
Legal space, the territory on which the laws of the country apply.
Teisinė erdvė tai yra teritorija, kurioje galioja to šalies įstatymai.
Financial space, where the same currency is used.
Finansinė erdvė, kur vartojama ta pati valiuta.
And then there are 2 spaces which never coincided with the whole territory of Ukraine. Informational space and cultural space.
Ir tada yra 2 erdvės, kurios niekada nesutapo su Ukrainos teritorija. Tai yra informacinė erdvė ir kultūrinė erdvė.
Part of Ukraine was under influence of Russian cultural and informational space.
Dalis Ukrainos teritorijos buvo Rusijos informacinės ir kultūrinės erdvės įtakoje.
Bessarabia and Bukovina were partially under influence of cultural and informational space of Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, etc. But this Bessarabia and Bukovina.
Besarabija ir Bukovina buvo veikiamos to kito parvio Moldovos, Rumunijos, Bulgarijos ir Vengrijos ir kitos pačios informacinės ir kultūrinės erdvės.
And this is the result of actually mismanagement, political mismanagement of Ukrainian politicians who didn't understand the importance of culture and information in the process of building the identity, and then identity becomes really the protection for the country.
Ir taip nutiko dėl to, kad prastai tvarkėsi Ukrainos politikai, kurie nesuprato, kokia svarbi yra informacija ir kultūra tam bendram tapatybės kūrimui, nes tapatybė ir sukuria šalį, suvienyje šalį.
And I'm not talking about Soviet influence, because in fact in daily life, when people speak in Ukraine in different regions, even in Ukrainian Western Ukrainian, they use in the conversations jokes and quotes from Soviet films until today, instead of quoting Ukrainian films and jokes from Ukrainian books.
Ir aš nekalbu apie sovietų įtaką, nes šiandien žmonės kasdieniniam gyvenime, kai cituoja ar juokauja, ar pasakoja anekdotus, tai pasakoja epizodus ar citatas iš sovietinių filmų, o ne iš ukrainietiškų.
For 15 years I was talking about necessity to have national film premieres and book premieres, so that in every city, in every town, on the same day, the same new Ukrainian film was shown, so that the country would speak about this film for 2 weeks, and then it would remain in the memory.
Aš 15 metų pasisakiau už tai, ar agitavau už tai, kad vyktų nacionalinės filmų premjeros, kai tą pačią dieną tas pats filmas būtų parodomas įvairiuose miestuose ir miesteliuose, ir tada 2 savaitės žmonės apie jį kalbėtųsi, ir tas filmas tuomet liktų tokia kultūrinė apyvartoj.
Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and it's still not happening.
Deja, to nenutiko ir nevyksta iki šiol.
Aš turėčiau dar klausimų, bet žinau, kad žiūriu į laikrodį ir žinau, kad mes nelabai daug laiko turime, tai labai kviečiu publiką.
I would have some more questions, but I can see that we don't have so much time, so I invite the audience to also ask something.
Jūs paminėjot, ką tik dabar tas informacinis erdvės, tame tarpe apie Bukoviną, apie Besarabiją kalbėjotės.
So you have now mentioned information space and the cases of Bukovina and Besarabia.
Aš asmeniškai kaip vertėjas, kaip žurnalistas daugelį metų stebiu Ukrainos kultūrinę erdvę ir kontekstą ir dalyvauju.
I have observed the Ukrainian cultural context as a journalist and writer for a long time, and I have been participating in it.
Ir mano akimis ilgą laiką visuomenės diskursas buvo orientuotas į tai, kad Ukrainoje egzistuoja 2 kalbos, tai yra ukrainiečių arba rusų.
And for a long time, my impression is that the general discourse was that 2 languages exist in Ukraine, that's Ukrainian and Russian.
Or Russian.
Or Russian,
Tuo tarpu asmeniškai turėjau be galo daug pokalbių, ypatingai rytų Ukrainoje.
Meanwhile, I've had a lot of personal conversations, in particular in eastern Ukraine,
kur mano pašnekovai buvo nuoširdžiai nustebinti ir nežinojo, kad Ukrainoje egzistuoja mokyklos lenkų mažumai, vengrų mažumai, rumunų mažumai ir panašiai.
Where the people I talked to were very surprised to learn that in Ukraine there are schools for the Polish minority, the Hungarian minority, and so on and so forth. Romanian.
Ir kai sakydavai, kad tikrai yra žmonių, kurie gimtoji kalba yra rumunų, arba vengrų, arba lenkų, jie to netikėjo.
And they wouldn't even believe when you tell them that there are people whose first language or mother tongue is Romanian or Hungarian or Polish.
Nes jų akimis žvelgiant tai gali būti tik tai arba rusų, arba ukrainiečių.
Because in their world it can only be either Russian or Ukrainian.
Dabar, kaip mes matome tą situaciją keičiasi dėl karo sąlygų.
So now we can see the situation shifting because of the conditions of war.
Yra žinomas pavyzdys, pavyzdžiui, naujo Ukrainos ambasadorius Budapešte Fedoro Šandoro, kuris yra iš Užkarpatės vengrų mažumos atstovas.
For example, the new Ukrainian ambassador in Hungary comes from the... Yeah.
Fyodor.
Yes. He comes from the Carpathian minority.
From Hungarians.
Hungarians, yeah.
Tai gali liudyti apie tai, kad tas požiūris iš dalies pradeda keistis.
And that may be an indication that those attitudes are gradually changing or beginning to change.
Ar jūsų nuomonė po karo yra vietos bendrai tapatybės būtent žmonėms, kurių prigimtoji tapatybė yra kita nei rusų ar ukrainiečių?
Do you believe after the war there will be a place in the common identity for the people whose first ethnic identity is other than Ukrainian or Russian?
Ačiū.
Actually, well, there will be place if Ukrainian politicians will continue to work on this issue.
Vieta atsiras, jeigu Ukrainos politikai ir toliau to klausimu dirbs.
Ukrainian politicians started talking about Crimean Tatars only after the annexation of Crimea.
Apie Krymo totorius ukrainiečių politikai pradėjo kalbėti tik po Krymo aneksijos.
In 2010, Ukrainian Secret Service SBU was spying on the Crimean Tatars and actually feeling very comfortable with Russian-speaking population and with Russian activists in Crimea.
Lygi tol Ukrainos specialios tarnybos šnipinėjo Krymo totorius, o labai patogiai jautėsi tarp rusakalbių Krymo gyventojų.
Hungarian minority is not integrated into Ukrainian society.
Vengrų mažuma nėra integruota į ukrainiečių visuomenę.
We have between 60 and 80 writers and poets who write in Hungarian language.
Yra tarp 60 ir 80 rašytojų ir poetų, kurie rašo vengrų kalba.
And there was not a single book translated into Ukrainian.
Ir nei viena jų knyga nebuvo išversta į ukrainiečių kalbą.
So also if you ask any Ukrainian journalist if he can name one Crimean Tatar writer, nobody will give you a name.
O jeigu bet kurio Ukrainos žurnalisto paklausite nurodyti bent vieną Krymo totorių rašytoją, niekas jokios pavardės jam nepasakys.
So I mean there is a lot of work to do with the work which was not done in 30 years of independence.
Taigi reikia padaryti dar labai daug darbo, kuris nebuvo padarytas per 30 nepriklausomybės metų.
Aš čia įsitepsiu ir bent girdėjau kažkada praėjusiais metais, mano vasaros pradžioje, kad čia taip linksmesnė gaidelė, liūdnai linksma gaidelė.
I would like to interfere with a happy sad note here, which I heard last summer.
Kad Ukrainos kariuomenė naudojasi vengrų kalbančiais kariais.
That the Ukrainian army is using Hungarian-speaking soldiers
Kaip ryšininkais.
as well to transfer messages in secret, like to instead of ciphers.
Nes tada priešininkas gali girdėti, bet negali suprasti.
Because then the enemy may hear them but not understand them.
Galbūt tai irgi padės šiek tiek suartėti ukrainiečiams su vengrais.
So that could also,
Ukrainos vengrais.
yeah. So that could also bring Ukrainians closer to Ukrainian Hungarians.
On the front line, actually, all the identities are integrated with each other.
Iš tikrųjų, fronte visos tapatybės integruojasi viena su kita.
Yeah, and actually, you don't need to speak Hungarian in Ukraine in order not to be understood. You can speak one of Ukrainian dialects.
Ir Ukrainoje net nereikia kalbėti vengriškai, kad tavęs niekas nesuprastų, kartais užtenka kurios nors ukrainiečių tarmės.
Jeigu dar yra labai norinčio ko nors paklausyti, tai klauskime, nes... O tada jau bus paskutinis klausimas.
Labai trumpai norėjau.
Just last question.
Norėjau labai trumpai paklausti, Sigita Barniškienė, koks yra jūsų nuomonė požiūris į prezidentą Zelenskį ir ar jis bus išrinktas vėl?
I have a very brief question. What do you think is the... What is the general or society's attitude towards President Zelensky and whether he will be re-elected?
Well, in Ukrainian tradition is not to re-elect somebody who was already elected once.
Ukrainiečių tradicija yra neperinkti to, kas vieną kartą jau buvo išrinktas.
Yeah, in 23 years of Putin's rule, we had 5 presidents.
Per 23 Putino valdymo metus mes jau turėjome 5 prezidentus.
I think Zelensky is thinking about second term, but the society is very dynamic, and you cannot predict the results of the elections in Ukraine.
Aš manau, kad Zelenskis svarsto apie antrą kadenciją, bet visuomenė yra labai dinamiška ir neįmanoma nuspėti, kokie bus rinkimų rezultatai.
He is not the only person from show business who wants to be a president.
Jis ne vienintelis šoumenas, kuris nori tapti prezidentu.
Tai gal šitą džiaugią gaidą ir baigime mūsų šios dienos darbus. Dabar laukia.
So let's finish with the day's work on this happy note.
Ačiū labai.